Rapport des comités.
Introduction of government bills.
Dépôt de projet de loi du
I
gouvernement.
recognize the Minister
Le ministre de l'Éducation. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, je propose qu'il me soit permis de déposer un projet de loi intitulé « Loi trouvant une solution au conflit de négociation de travail avec le syndicat du SCFP » et qu'elle soit lue une première fois. M. Lecce a proposé qu'il lui soit permis de déposer un projet de loi intitulé « Loi trouvant une solution au conflit de travail avec le syndicat
That leave be given to introduce a bill entitled An Act to resolve labour disputes involving school board employees represented by the Canadian Union of Public Employees. All those in favour of the motion will please rise one at a time and be recognized by the clerk.
Mr. Lecce.
Mr. Lecce.
Mr. McNaughton.
Mr. McNaughton.
Ms. Mulrooney.
Ms. Mulrooney.
Mr. Calandra.
Mr. Calandra.
Mr. Fideli.
Mr. Fideli.
Mr. Ford, Etobicoke North.
Mr. Ford, Etobicoke North.
Mr. Bethlen Falvey.
Mr. Bethlen Falvey.
Mr. Sarkaria.
Mr. Sarkaria.
Mr. Clark.
Mr. Clark.
Mr. Smith Bay of Quinte.
Mr. Smith Bay of Quinte.
Ms. Surma.
Ms. Surma.
Mr. Downey.
Mr. Downey.
Mr. Rickford.
Mr. Rickford.
Mr. Smith Perry Salmuskoka.
Mr. Smith Perry Salmuskoka.
Mr. Tabolo.
Mr. Tabolo.
Mr. Ford, York Southweston.
Ford, York Southweston.
Mr. Lumsden.
Mr. Lumsden.
Mr. Peary.
Mr. Peary.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Mr. Piccini.
Mr. Piccini.
Mr. Gill.
Mr. Gill.
Ms. Williams.
Ms. Williams.
Mr. Cho Willowdale.
Mr. Joe Willowdale.
Mr. Rashid.
Mr. Rashid.
Ms. Dunlop.
Ms. Dunlop.
Mr. Kersner.
Mr. Kersner.
Mr. Romano.
Mr. Romano.
Mr. Cazzetto.
Mr. Cazzetto.
Ms. Hogarth.
Ms. Hogarth.
Mr. Harris.
Mr. Harris.
Ms. Scott.
Ms. Scott.
Mr. Bailey.
Mr. Bailey.
Ms. Barnes.
Ms. Barnes.
Mr. Cook.
Mr. Cook.
Ms. Trantaflopoulos.
Mr. Trantafilopoulos.
Mr. Coe.
Mr. Coe.
Ms. Martin.
Ms. Martin.
Mr. Crawford.
Mr. Crawford.
Mr. Yakubuski.
Mr. Yakubuski.
Mr. Holland.
Mr. Holland.
Mr. Fanny Gastelum.
Mr. Tandy Gastelum.
Ms. Dixon.
Ms. Dixon.
Mr. Hardiman.
Mr. Hardiman.
Ms. Tangri.
Mrs. Tangri.
Mr. Sarazin.
Mr. Sarazin.
Mr. Sabawi.
Mr. Sabawi.
Mr. Liardi.
Mr. Liardi.
Mr. Flack.
Mr. Flack.
Mr.
Quinn.
Quinn.
Mr. Quinn.
Mr. Pang.
Mr. Pang.
Mr. Byers.
Mr. Byers.
Mr. Osterhoff.
Mr. Osterhoff.
Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Jordan.
Ms. Pierre.
Ms. Pierre.
Ms. Wide.
Ms. Wide.
Mr. Anand.
Mr. Anand.
Ms. Skelly.
Ms. Skelly.
Mr. Saunderson.
Mr. Saunderson.
Mr. Sandu.
Mr. Sandu.
Mr. Smith, Peterborough Kawartha.
Mr. Smith, Peterborough Kawartha.
Mr. Bauma.
Mr. Bauma.
Mr. Kanapathi.
Mr. Kanapathi.
Ms. Gamari.
Ms. Gamari.
Mr. Brzee.
Mr. Brzee.
Mr. Jones, Chatham, Kent, Leamington.
Mr. Jones, Chatham, Kent, Leamington.
Ms. Gallagher Murphy.
Ms. Gallagher Murphy.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. Dowie.
Mr. Dowie.
Mr. Smith, Scarborough Centre.
Mr. Smith, Scarborough Centre.
Mr. Greywall.
Mr. Greywall.
Mr. Ray.
Mr. Ray.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise one at a time and be recognized by the clerk.
Ms. Pasma.
Ms. Pasma.
Deputy Jelena.
Deputy Jelena.
Mr. Vantoff.
Mr. Vantoff.
Ms. Sattler.
Ms. Sattler.
Ms. Begum.
Ms. Begum.
Mr. Mamakwa.
Mr. Mamakwa.
MPP Bell.
MPP Bell.
Ms. Fife.
Ms. Fife.
Ms. Armstrong.
Ms. Armstrong.
Deputy Montha.
Deputy Montha.
Ms. French.
Ms. French.
MPP Styles.
MPP Styles.
MPP Kernahan.
MPP Kernahan.
MPP West.
MPP West.
MPP Stevens.
MPP Stevens.
Mr. Gates.
Mr. Gates.
MPP Andrew.
MPP Andrew.
Ms. Carpoche.
Ms. Carpoche.
Mr. Birch.
Mr. Birch.
Mr. Bourgoin.
Mr. Bourgoin.
MPP Glover.
MPP Glover.
MPP Wong-Tam.
MPP Wong-Tam.
Mr. Rakosovic.
Mr. Rakosovic.
MPP Hardin.
MPP Hardin.
MPP Bourgeois.
MPP Bourgeois.
Mr. Fraser.
Mr. Fraser.
Ms. Hunter.
Ms. Hunter.
Mr. Schreiner.
Mr. Schreiner.
Madame Collard.
Madame Collard.
Mr. Blais.
Mr. Blais.
Ms. Bowman.
Ms. Bowman.
Ms. McMahon.
Ms. McMahon. The ayes are 71, the nays are 32.
The ayes being 71 and the nays being 32, I declare the motion carried.
This is a bill entitled An Act to Resolve Labour Disputes Involving School Board Employees Represented by the Canadian Union of Public Employees. First reading of the bill, première lecture du projet de loi.
Would the Minister care to briefly explain his bill?
Thank you, Speaker. The Keeping Students in Class Act 2022 would, if passed, keep kids learning in school without disruption, critical to catching up on their studies, along with supporting their mental and physical health. This legislation will prohibit strikes and walkouts during the term of operation of the collective agreements and require termination of any strikes already underway following over 2 years of learning loss. This legislation would have passed ensure students remain in class with a refocus on learning, catching up in extracurricular activities, and quality education. Mr. Speaker, this legislation will protect the interests of 2 million children, their working parents, and the communities that depend on equitable access to nutrition, mental health supports, developmental services, and quite simply access to a safe place. It is for them, Speaker, it is for all students that we are acting to keep kids in class.
Order. The House will come to order. Introduction of government bills. Introduction of bills. Statements by the Ministry. Motions. I recognize the Government House Leader.
Speaker, I'm seeking unanimous consent that, notwithstanding any standing order or special order of the House, that the House continue to meet tomorrow, Tuesday, November 1st, 2022, beyond the ordinary hour of adjournment until midnight.
Government House Leader is seeking the unanimous consent of the House that, notwithstanding any standing order or special order of the House, that the House continue to meet tomorrow, Tuesday, November 1st, 2022, beyond the ordinary hour of adjournment until midnight. Agreed? No. I heard a no. Government House Leader.
Speaker, I am seeking unanimous consent that, notwithstanding any standing order, of special order of the House, that tomorrow, Tuesday, November 1st, 2022, the House shall meet at 5 a.m. for orders of the day.
Government House Leader is seeking unanimous consent of the House that, notwithstanding any standing order or special order of the House, that tomorrow, Tuesday, November 1st, 2022, the House shall meet at 5 a.m. for orders of the day. Agreed? No. I heard some no's.
We have 3 more days of bargaining scheduled, despite the tabling of this legislation and its attempt to try to impose an inadequate contract. They may think, the Minister of Education and the Premier, that they can rely on this bully tactic. But I want you to know, we've been holding mass meetings of our members across the province over the last week. Thousands of our members have been clear. They have been expressing their commitment to good wages, good working conditions, better educational environments. So on Friday, regardless of what this legislation says, our members will be engaging in a province-wide protest. That means no CUPE education worker will be at work. Instead, we will be taking a stand for public education, for ourselves, for our future. These workers have been subject to having their rights trampled on for more than a decade. Laura mentioned Bill 115 that opened every collective agreement, rewrote sick leave provisions, and mandated 0 wage increases. And then they saw Bill 124, as did so many other public sector workers. Our union and others have been effective in challenging governments in the courts, and we've won, but all too late for workers. Enough is enough. We may, in fact, challenge this in court, but we are first going to challenge it in our communities. We are not going to allow our rights to be legislated away. We are not going to simply stand by and accept this attempt by the government to bully our members and to send a message that they somehow have the ability to continue to do this to workers. They may think they have a majority in the legislature. We have a majority across the province. There is growing support for our members in our union, from parents and families, and from others. we will take a stand and we will do everything we can to defend our members' rights and to defend public education. And I'm enormously proud to be part of a union that will do that. I'm also here today to tell you that our national union has been clear across the country, from coast to coast to coast. Leaders have been clear that they support our members when they make a decision to stand up for themselves and to stand up for public education. And that means we support them in any and every way possible. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. I'll call on Patty and then we'll take questions.
Thank you, Laura. My name is Patty Coates, and I'm the president of the Ontario Federation of Labour, and I represent over 1 million Ontario workers from 54 affiliated unions. And I am honoured to be standing shoulder to shoulder with my colleagues from OSCBU and CUPE Ontario today. And, you know, this fight is not theirs alone. This fight is not just for education workers. This fight is for all workers. This fight is for all Ontarians who believe that worker power matters, that governments and corporations should not be able to unilaterally impose their will on workers, and that the only way workers make gains is by coming together. This government says they're working for workers. This is not what working for workers looks like. Working for workers means respecting our collective bargaining rights. It means investing in good jobs, not undermining the process. It means showing up to the collective bargaining table committed to reaching a deal. These are bully tactics, as Fred had said, plain and simple. This is a government who doesn't want workers to make any gains. And so they're taking their ball and they're going home. This government has a long track record of trampling over workers' rights. Their very first act in office in 2018 was back to work legislation that ended a strike of 2,000 academic workers at York University without even addressing any of their funding or job security concerns. Then, in 2019, they passed Bill 124, a wage suppression bill that stopped public sector workers from negotiating fair wages. The public health crisis we're currently living through in the province is a direct result of that legislative interference. I come from an education background. I was my local OSSTF president for 16 years, and before that, I was an educational assistant in the classroom. I also have family who are CUPE members, education workers, and I know how hard education workers work. I stand with them, as do our more than 1 million workers here in Ontario. And I'm calling on every worker who has the benefit of a collective agreement to stand with us, to stand with CUPE education workers in our fight back against this blatant attack on our fundamental rights to free and fair collective bargaining. We are in solidarity.
Thank you. Questions, Richard? I know you have one.
I want to make it clear. Your members are striking. They're walking off the job on Friday?
Yes.
Are you concerned about any consequences from that?
I'm concerned about the consequences that will happen if we don't fight back. Right now, I have spent a week going across the province talking to thousands of workers who have said to me, if I don't get a real wage increase, I can no longer work here. The mass exodus of education workers that's going to happen, if this legislation is allowed, is going to be detrimental to the services that my child and millions of children have in our public education system.
Just a one-day strike? Are you going to be striking on Monday too?
That will be, left up to what happens. I think it's time for this government to understand people are not in support of them. They have 18% of the popular vote. We had 82.6% of our members show up and say, no more. It is time for this government to understand you just don't bully. We asked to go back to the table last week. They told me they needed more pressure. When we apply more pressure, they then legislate us. I think it's clear who's been on a path all the way along.
What are the potential consequences if you defy this new legislation?
There are consequences, and we have shared those with our members. I think there's also consequences for not fighting. At what point, as people in Ontario, do we stand up and say, enough is enough?
But you're going to face fines, Laura.
Yes.
So what are those fines? What are the daily
Those fines are determined by the Ministry of Labour, and our union is 100% in support and will be coming through with the financial support for those.
What about your members who, by your definition have said are people who are struggling? Can they afford to go on an extended strike in this kind of environment?
So what's really scary is the amount of strike pay that they will receive often is more than what they receive from their employer right now.
Do you have any sense of what proportion of your members that's true of?
So many, especially anyone who goes on EI over the summer. During EI over the summer is a taxable, and they receive less, and they still have to pay for their benefits. These are pieces that are taken care of by the union while we are in a strike position. I think what we really need to understand is, why is it we are forcing these folks on the brink of poverty to stand up against a government that clearly disrespects workers, not just education workers, but you've heard the minister say time and time again, whatever happens for CUPE is going to lay the groundwork for public workers, public sector workers everywhere. When do we say enough is enough? And I am so proud because our members have said enough is enough now.
Fred, can I ask you a quick question? You used the word monstrous overreach, which got my attention when it comes to tabling this legislation. Is the government indirectly telling your members just how important their role is in the schools, or is there another reason behind this monstrous overreach? It just seems though not allowing the strike bargaining to happen, it seems like they're coming down with a very heavy hammer. So are they saying how important these low-paid employees are, or do you think there's something else going on here?
There's nothing in what we understand to be in this legislation that should in any way imply that the government is trying to communicate to workers how important they are. In fact, as we've heard, it legislates a collective agreement, violating their rights, uses the heaviest hammer imaginable to do so, and imposes wages and other conditions that are simply inadequate, that we know are inadequate, that our members know are inadequate, that parents and families know are inadequate. That's why it's such a monstrous overreach. They didn't just prevent a strike. They didn't just say, yeah, off to arbitration with you. They're writing the collective agreement for workers. We've seen this before. And my God, I'm so proud that our members have finally decided we're not going to take this anymore. We're going to stand up and say no. No, you can't just do that and not face repercussions. Questions about repercussions for us? Let's talk about repercussions for the Conservatives.
I know you don't have a crystal ball. What would be another reason why they would come down with such monstrous overreach, to use your words?
Because they disrespect workers fundamentally, because they don't understand the importance, the fundamental importance of free collective bargaining, because they think they run the show because they have a majority in the legislature, and they don't have a majority in the province.
Fred, you called the action Friday, you referred to it as a protest. Laura clearly called it a strike. Is there a reason that you chose the word protest?
Today, our members have the legal right to strike, and they've served notice to do so beginning November the 4th. We don't know exactly what's in this bill. I don't know if any of you seen it, but we certainly didn't. They asked for unanimous consent, and then everything disappeared. But if that bill passes before Friday, it doesn't matter. If they say it's illegal to strike, then we will be on a political protest. We will withdraw our labor, and we will fight back against this attempt to remove our members' rights and to institute a collective agreement. Our members have made that decision, and we proudly support them in doing that.
So this government this government campaigned on and received a number of union endorsements. What do you expect those unions to do now?
I certainly hope that my colleagues in the labour movement will see this for what it is, a blatant attack on workers' rights. It is impossible for any of us to stand by while one group of workers is attacked and not expect that at some point that same attack might come our way. So, the small number of some unions that decided that they were going to buy the government's line about building. I trust that they will do the right thing, but I'll tell you this. No matter what others do, our members have decided what they're going to do, and our union has decided what it's going to do. We're going to support our members every step of the way while they stand up and fight for their rights and for the rights of their students and for the rights of public education.
So your workers are some of the quietest workers in the education system. Yes, I know they're unionized, but they're people who are ed assistants, people who are working in the offices, maintenance staff. You don't hear them really at the front line like you do some of the other unions. So why do you think they're prepared to take this move? Do you think they're actually willing to do this?
Because I know they're willing to do this, because as Laura said, we've been in mass meetings across the province to check in on this very clear decision with them. But prior to that, more than 83%, as Laura reminded us, participated. More than 45,000 people voted in a strike vote. They provided a 96.5% mandate. That is the largest participation level that we have ever seen in our union's history. People are clear because they've had enough. It's been a decade for these workers of having their rights trampled, of us fighting in court and winning. Sure, we won. Bill 115 was declared unconstitutional. And what happened? Those workers got 0 wage increases mandated. They got their sick leave programs disappeared, and one imposed by government. And it's why they're ready at this point, after that time, after Bill 124 that mandated wages. At some point, workers have to make this decision. When will enough be enough? And I am so proud that they have decided this is that point. Enough is enough.
Could you give us a kind of a rundown on what happened at that meeting yesterday? Like we have the government side of what happened here. They moved their position, their negotiating position slightly, and then they said you guys didn't take you wouldn't rule out a strike. So what actually happened in that meeting?
I'll definitely take you through. So we received a call early in the morning that they would like to meet with us. As a matter of fact, we did not know until later in the afternoon that it would be a full pass. And what's really disappointing about that is that my bargaining team comes from all over the province. I got a call on a Sunday morning, and trying to get people in from all over the province is just not possible. They provided us a full pass. Now, when somebody says they're providing you a full pass in bargaining, that means that you're going to take it, you're going to look at it, and you're going to continue bargaining. When we got there, we were informed that this would be legislated. That is not bargaining. That is an ultimatum. That is not saying we're interested in working together collaboratively, which comes as no surprise because this minister has yet to work with us collaboratively. But what they did is give us a piece of legislation that gives an extra nickel to workers, that rips apart their short-term disability leave, that provides no security for services that parents and students rely on, and inadequate funding to ensure those services are there, and then walked away.
Like literally they walked away.
That was the end. The ultimatum was, you need to pull back your strike or we're going to go on legislation. To be fair, there is nothing in that document that would see workers choose to give up their legal right to strike.
So,
had you decided to agree to not go on strike this Friday, could negotiations still have continued, in your opinion?
We are still going to be negotiating. We are actually putting forth a pass tomorrow morning at 10 a.m.
What will that be saying?
Well, we're going to be working on it today when I'm done here.
Will you be moving down from?
We will be moving.
Okay.
But we're not going to be moving to where they're headed.
Can you give us an idea of what?
I can't until I speak to the bargaining team.
Okay.
Yeah.
So negotiations aren't done. If you could just kind of
Negotiations aren't done. This is a piece of legislation that was just proposed. It hasn't been passed. It's just a piece of paper that has been received at Queen's Park. We are going to continue on as we said that we would and we committed to, which were negotiation dates, the 1st, the 2nd, and the 3rd. We came in good faith. It's unfortunate that this government did not.
So 2 quick questions. One, you're going to be on strike on Friday if nothing changes. How many days, like is that a 1-day strike or is this potentially for several days, if not weeks?
I don't have a crystal ball. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think what we need to recognize is that there needs to be a clear move by this government not to legislate, but to work with families, to work with students, and to work with education workers. And they're ready to fight for as long as it takes for that to happen.
So my follow-up to you is, this new legislation includes the use of a notwithstanding clause. So 10 years ago, we saw Dalton McGuinty do this, and 6 years, it took 6 years before it went through the courts and it was ruled unconstitutional. There will be no option for a court battle. What does that mean to you? What is your reaction to that?
I think we need to find out is, what is the reaction of people in Ontario in general, that you have a government that will strip away your charter rights when they're not getting their way. People aren't fighting us because we're weak or because we're quiet. The government is fighting us because we're strong. And we are willing to commit whatever it takes to ensure the kids in our community get what they need, because this government has not, and it's time.
Laura, can you talk about the message you're trying to send on Halloween with what you're wearing today?
Thank you. Well, listen, I am an EA, and we dress up every year for Halloween, no matter what. And I thought if there was ever a time in my career that I could dress up as Rosie Riveter and send a clear message that we could do it, today's the day that I needed to do it.
That you think the public is behind you, but parents are very concerned. They've gone through 2 academic years with the pandemic where there was a great deal of disruption. Prior to that, the year before, there was a lot of labor strife in the school system, a lot of uncertainty. So why do you think the public's in your corner after 3 years of children's education being up in the air and disrupted?
Because they know that CUPE members have been on site in our schools for the last 3 years, every day that students needed us. We've never been on strike. During the pandemic, we were on site. Now we are on site. But when I hear stories of mums that need to be outside of their school because they are the ones that have to provide the personal care for their child because the school board cannot afford to assign an EA, that is why we are fighting. That mom should not have to do that. That daughter should have access to those supports. And the reason that they don't is because of the government. Not because of workers, but because this government fails to put into place the funding is required. If Stephen Lecce cared about kids, he wouldn't have taken $200 and just handed it to parents. He wouldn't have cut $800 per child out of the education system. If Stephen Lecce really cared about keeping kids in class, perhaps we need to ask him why we still have mandatory virtual learning for 2 credits in order to graduate. The man is a walking, contradiction. He doesn't care about kids. We know that keeping kids in schools is about parents being able to work. That is more concerning for him than the services that these kids need.
Laura, I thought I heard or read that 70% of your members are women. If that is accurate, does that suggest anything to you, or does it cause you some concerns for a variety of reasons?
Huge concerns. It's very interesting that this spring, construction workers across this province went on strike. I stood proudly with them on picket lines. Nobody put forth legislation that was Keep the Buildings Going Act. But yet, when it comes down to the lowest paid, predominantly female, here we are. Once they start to get loud and start to show their strength, this government comes in to strip apart their rights. And yes, there I am wearing the Rosie Riveter for a reason. That is something that as women we have lived with in the past, and I am not prepared as a strong woman and a strong worker in Ontario to let this government do that again.
Do you think there's a message subliminally, covertly being sent here with regards to that?
I don't want to give the government credit for that level. I think right now, they're using the nuclear option because a group of workers have gotten extremely strong. And I think it's amazing that workers have gotten extremely strong. And I call on my other co-workers, be it unionized or not, you can use your voice. And I encourage every single person, family member, grandma, grandpa, auntie, uncle, use your voice right now. Our kids are not doing well in school. Just being in the building does not mean you're being educated or getting the services. That's something this government doesn't understand. They talk about having hospital beds. But without staff, you're not getting health care. You can have kids in school, but without staff, they're not being supported or educated.
Have you had conversations with other education support workers about whether they'll be joining you on picket lines on Friday?
We are having many conversations ongoing right now as we speak.
So it's a possibility that even in boards where they think they can handle things without CUPE, that you could have ETFO or SSTF members out too?
Absolutely. Scary, huh?
Well, and we just received a statement from ETFO saying that they've walked away from the bargaining table today based on what's happening. They feel they could not continue in good conscience.
And I think that's a really clear message that people need to think about. Imagine being the people who are sitting at a bargaining table right now and your government has legislated the lowest paid. Is that really good faith bargaining by this government moving forward for all of my teaching colleagues? Or what message are they trying to send to my teaching colleagues? Give us what we want or we'll legislate you too? It's bullying. That's all this is.
Do you expect that any private sector construction workers are going to join you in solidarity? I've been reaching out to a lot of them and I haven't heard back from any of them. Are you worried that they're just going to sit on their hands and let you guys go without their support?
There are so many workers that are joining us that whether they're leaders or not come out and say it, workers are. And I think that's really what's been important in our entire campaign. This is not a leader-led campaign. This is a worker-led campaign. Workers are collectively using their voices. And I encourage workers, no matter what sector they're in, to use their voices and recognize that an attack on one worker is an attack on us all, but a victory for a worker is a victory for us all.
What happens if they don't see that way anymore? If they don't come out and support you, does that mean the PCs are starting to successfully split the labor movement?
It is such a small group that have provided their support. But I will turn it over to Patty because I know the OFL is doing some amazing work in this regards.
Thank you, Laura. We are reaching out to all of our unions, all of the heads of unions, and all of the workers that are covered by collective agreements to lend our support and solidarity to the CUPE education workers. We're going to have those ongoing conversations. We've already had conversations with the building trades in many, many areas. We're all workers. And this government is not working for workers, especially when they trample on our rights, our right to collective bargaining. And I know as an education worker myself, it has been over decades that they've been attacked. Education workers, year after year after year after year, they have been attacked. And, it's time that we all stand up, all workers stand up against this bully government and taking their tantrums using the notwithstanding clause. I think that's cowardice. They need to stand up. They need to be talking to workers. I will tell you, as the president representing over 1 million workers, not once has Ford reached out to me, and we've reached out to him many times, and only once has a Minister of Labour reached out, and I've yet to have a meeting with the Minister of Labour. So, we stand in support. We're going to continue to stand in support, and we will be making some announcements as to what's going to be happening on streets over the next couple of days, bringing our solidarity and workers together. So thank you.
Laura, we're going to need to wrap up because we're going to ask you to report soon.
Yep. So I want to thank you, everyone. I'm sure we will be talking more over the next few days. Take care.
Hi, everyone. This legislation today is deeply disappointing. As a parent, as someone who's spoken to thousands of parents over the past year and as the official opposition education critic, what we're seeing is Doug Ford and Stephen Lecce bullying the lowest paid education workers, driving them out of the education system and putting our kids' education at risk. At the end of the day, it's our kids who are going to pay the price, and it's the kids who have the highest needs for accessibility and supports who pay the greatest price. And I think that is incredibly telling about this government. And I'm happy to take your questions.
What do you make of the government using the notwithstanding clause again?
I think it's incredibly chilling. This isn't the first time we've seen this from this government, that when they don't get their own way, they're prepared to run roughshod over the rights of workers and students. I think it speaks to the extent to which this legislation is a bullying tactic.
They say they're doing it, though, to prevent disruptions in schools. I mean, don't students deserve a year without disruptions? Did they not have a point there?
Absolutely. And I mean, parents remember which government it was that shut down schools for 27 weeks during the pandemic. The problem is that we're already seeing disruptions because of worker shortages. We're already seeing situations where one EA is being asked to support 6 kids, where schools don't have custodians or ECEs to fill positions. And this government is telling workers who already can't afford to do their job that they're only going to pay them a nickel an hour more. So we're going to continue to see these kinds of disruptions. In fact, we're going to see more because workers can't afford to work in this sector any longer.
So the bill has some fines for illegal strikes, and they're quite onerous. They're $4,000 per the individual and $500,000 for the union. We did some quick math, and that if all of them go on strike on Friday, it could cost the CUPE millions of dollars. What do you make of that prospect of seeing such a big union get sort of fined into oblivion if they go on strike?
Well, we're still analyzing all the elements of the bill ourselves. We just saw it too, but I think once again, this speaks to the fact that the legislation is ultimately a bullying tactic, and this government is bullying the lowest paid education workers, predominantly women. It's bullying the people who support our kids day in and day out, and primarily it's bullying the people who support our kids who need supports the most day in and day out. And at the end of the day, it's these workers and their kids, and it's our kids in school who need these supports who are going to pay the price for this government's bully tactics.
Is there anything that can stop this government? It has a massive majority and it's willing to use the notwithstanding clause. So what can possibly be done?
Stephen Lecce's conscience? The minister's holding all the cards here. He's got 4 days to come to the table with a deal that actually ensures that workers can come to work day in and day out and support our kids without having to use food banks, that workers will stay in the system, and that our kids will get the supports they need without further disruptions to their education.
There are a lot of workers in Ontario who are low paid, and they will not be getting an 11.7% increase in their salary, an annual increase. So how do you support that particular ask?
We have already seen the consequences of a situation where workers have to use food banks and work multiple jobs to make ends meet. And the reality is that they are leaving the sector despite the fact that they love the work that they do and they feel committed to our kids. We are already seeing shortages throughout the sector, and workers are telling us they simply cannot continue to afford to work in this sector if they have to use food banks. And so if the government wants to follow through on its promise of stability and supports for our kids, then the government is going to have to come to the table with a deal that means these workers can afford to work in the sector, that they don't have to use food banks.
What message do you think this sends to the other education unions currently in bargaining right now?
I think it shows that the government is not actually prepared to do what it takes to give our kids a stable year and make sure that they have all the supports that they need. I think it shows that the government is more interested in being a bully than in actually supporting our kids. At the end of the day, it's our kids, it's the parents, and it's the workers throughout the system who pay the price for that.
Does the NDP support the idea of going on a protest/strike on Friday?
Look, we have 4 days until there's a protest/strike. The minister is the one holding all the cards here. The minister can come to the table at any time over the next 4 days with a deal that prevents disruptions to our kids, and that's what I am begging him to please do.
Okay, folks.
Thank you for going.
Thank you.
Yeah, much appreciated.
Today's developments in the legislature have made it clear that this government's priorities when it comes to legislation are not students or parents, but rather themselves. The Minister of Education should not be here today introducing legislation to bully and force essential education workers back to work. In fact, he's introducing legislation to force them back to work before they have even entered a strike. Where the education minister should be is at the negotiating table, working to reach an equitable deal that is negotiated at the table that will ensure our kids are safe and in school where they want to be. And it is critical that any deal values our education workers and is fair to them. At a time when this government has reported a $2.1 billion surplus, They are reducing education spending and systematically cutting funding out of our system. The fact is, education workers have kept our schools safe during the global pandemic, and it is at significant risk to their health and the well-being of themselves and their families that they did this. They have had no real wage increase in quite some time and are now facing record inflation and a possible recession. So it is important to be clear that the workers the education minister is bullying back to work with this preemptive legislation are some of the lowest paid education workers in Ontario's system. Today, this minister is saying through his legislation that these heroes of our education system are not valued. He is saying to these workers that their government are worth more than these workers are being treated, and they are not able to put food on the table and to feed their families without taking 2 and 3 jobs. The federal Liberal government put people first during the pandemic and in fact gave the Ontario government funding to help our education system. They were there for Canadians and willing to do whatever it took to look after people and to get through this once in a lifetime event. Here in Ontario, the Ford government hoarded the money. They're socking it away in contingency funds. They are padding their books. The FAO has cited over the next few years, it's going to be $6 billion that will be taken out of education. And at the end of the day, this government is clearly saying that they are not here to help people who need it the most. And they are certainly not here to help our education workers. In fact, what they are doing today with this legislation is creating far more chaos and uncertainty for parents and for students. Thank you. I will now take your questions.
Given the two sides were so far apart and so entrenched, what else could the government have done? I mean, the Liberal government a decade ago also imposed contracts on teachers.
The Liberal government never introduced preemptive legislation. It was only after there was a prolonged and protracted labor disruption that back-to-work legislation was introduced, when it would put at risk the students being able to complete their term. That's not the case in this instance. This minister, from the very beginning, threatened to use legislation as a bullying tactic during these negotiations. And frankly, he has poisoned the negotiating environment. We see where not only is CUPE declaring that as soon as they are legally able to strike that they will, it's also other education labor unions have withdrawn their bargaining days. So we are spiraling into chaos in our education system. And this was solely created by Minister Lecce and Premier Ford in their poor treatment of these education workers, despite the fact that they have a strong mandate from their own members to withdraw service.
Did Liberals support the plan of the union to go on protest on Friday?
Well, listen, another egregious act of this legislation is the use of the notwithstanding clause. That diminishes our Constitution and the democracy for all Canadians. And, this government cannot negotiate and close off on a collective agreement with one labor union without resorting to the use of the notwithstanding clause. So, workers, to express their dissatisfaction with what is happening at the bargaining table, took to protesting and demonstrating. And I could just imagine that maybe we're in for more of that because of the disrespect that Minister Lecce and Premier Ford has shown with the introduction of this legislation, that they don't value education workers, that they don't respect the bargaining process. And they won't even show up to the bargaining table. There's still 3 days left that they can negotiate a deal. Why are they not at the table instead of introducing this very presumptive and draconian form of legislation that uses the notwithstanding clause to get what they want.
Mitch, are you concerned this could be precedent setting? And I say this not disrespectfully, but you've got educational workers work very hard and they're getting paid very little, but yet this hammer is being dropped on them. Is that a concern for you and your party with regards to what could happen in the future with those who may be deemed even more important than education workers, where they can just drop that hammer and say you guys are all going back to work?
It absolutely is a slippery slope. Using such a very aggressive way to treat workers who are within their bargaining rights of collective bargaining. They are doing step bargaining. They've followed every legal step required of them. And what is required of the government is to stick with the negotiations at the table until you hammer out a deal. You know, today they're introducing an order in council to bring the legislature back at 5 a.m. tomorrow morning to debate the legislation. Well, why don't you stay at the bargaining table round the clock until you get a deal? Oftentimes, it is at those final hours of hard bargaining that a deal is done. That's what should be done. And yet this government is diminishing the bargaining process by resorting to the use of legislation, by resorting to the use of the notwithstanding clause, which was not contemplated for the everyday use of provincial governments. It was supposed to be an exceptional clause that was used in very unique circumstances. This is not a unique circumstance. This is progressive bargaining, and this government doesn't have the courage or the confidence to complete the bargaining process without introducing this legislation. I believe that it is wrong, and I believe that it is taking away the bargaining rights and the bargaining abilities of some of our workers who are the most valued in our school system, that school secretary, that EA that works with those special need students, those early childhood educators. We know that there's been so much learning loss at the younger years in terms of our kindergarten students having social and emotional development. They need the attention of those ECEs right now to help them to catch up. And instead of investing in our public education system, Minister Lecce and Premier Ford are taking resources out of the education system. $1.8 billion they are cutting from education and saying that they cannot afford to pay these lowest paid workers more, giving them lowball offers, disrespecting them in the use of this draconian legislation. It is wrong.
Mitzi, what other unions have withdrawn their bargaining dates, like you mentioned a few minutes ago?
Yeah, from my information that I've received, I'm the education critic for the Ontario Liberal Party and former Minister of Education. And from what I'm hearing from the sector is that they are not happy with today's legislation. Not only is it disrespectful to the bargaining process that CUPE was undertaking, it also really does not bode well for the other education unions as well, who were preparing their bargaining dates. And so, you know, I believe that everyone is now reconsidering how much they can trust this government to do free and fair bargaining. And I believe that today trust was broken with the introduction of this legislation.
During question period, Minister Lecce sort of mentioned that whatever the education workers get, it ends up sort of being the base level minimum for what the other education unions want. As someone with some experience in this area, can you tell us how true that is?
That is a very complicated question, but I will attempt to give a response, because it really all depends on the parameters and the scope of negotiation that the unions propose and that the government accepts. So as a practice within the education sector, there is what is known as a Me Too part of the agreement, that they can settle an agreement at the negotiating table, but if there are other points that are negotiated with education workers at another stage of negotiations, that they will have the opportunity to also receive that point as well. So if it's based on salaries or some other benefit, that they don't have to worry about closing off their agreement and missing out on some aspect, because they can address it later on with that specific Me Too clause.
So it's a legitimate concern here that if they give these education workers the increase they want, then it'll just spiral into more spending for other types of education employees.
Well, someone has to go first in terms of the bargaining process, and so it really just allows the process to happen by not being worried of who goes first. You just go first, you complete your negotiations, and the next unions will do their negotiations, and then you can relook at any aspect of the deal that does apply to your members. You'll have an opportunity to do that.
Mitzi, how does the government settle on what the fines are going to be? We're seeing $4,000 per individual, $500,000 for the union. I was looking at Bill 115 from 2012. I know I weren't minister then, but there's nothing mentioned about the fines there. So can you kind of just walk us through how the fine amounts are decided upon?
The final amounts?
The amount that an individual or a union would be fined if they were in contravention of legislation, like how do they decide what that's going to be?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I'm only now just reading the legislation that was just tabled. It is obviously written from the government's point of view, but the government is not the final arbiter of the law. That we have, under our constitutional democracy, we have a judiciary that it will have an opportunity to hear from these unions if they choose to take this to the courts, and that's definitely at risk when you look at this legislation. Even though they've evoked the notwithstanding clause to try to avoid that sort of litigation, but the labor unions will still have the opportunity to take this forward and to express their concern that their rights are being denied for free and fair collective bargaining. In terms of the awards that are given through the courts for any breach, that is it's really up to the judge to decide what that is. In the case of the remedy that was put forward for Bill 115, the justice actually had the unions and the government work out the remedy together, and had to sit down and figure out what the value was of the loss of the opportunity to negotiate a fair settlement, which is why, as interim leader John Fraser said, this government should, take the opportunity, do the hard work now of negotiating a deal with the labor unions, because at the end of the day, you're just going to cost time and money if it has to go through the courts. Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay. Okay. Well, good afternoon, colleagues. The government has made clear our commitments to stand up and ensure children remain in class. As you know, we made an offer to CUPE yesterday. We attempted to resolve our differences by working with a well-respected mediator. But CUPE yesterday failed to make any substantial concessions on their demands. And now, CUPE has made clear their intention to strike starting Friday, even after the government brought an increased offer of up to 10% over 4 years while protecting the best pension, benefits, and 131 days of paid sick leave. If we do not act today with legislation, schools will close on Friday. And if we do not introduce this law today and pass it ahead of Thursday, CUPE will again be able to walk out of class with hours' notice. To us, the choice is clear. We are acting decisively in the defense of students so that these kids can finally maintain stability and learn and grow after the last difficult years. The government has been left with no choice but to take immediate action today. And that's why we introduced the Keeping Students in Class Act that would establish a 4-year collective agreement with CUPE education workers across the province that ensures children remain in class where they belong. And I want to emphasize that we're not taking a blanket approach to all education sector unions. We will continue to bargain with Ontario's other education unions to reach a fair agreement in good faith while remaining squarely focused on what matters most to parents and to this government, which is stability for children after an extraordinary difficulty of the pandemic. As for CUPE, it is quite unfortunate that it has come down to this situation. But Ontario's nearly 2 million students have been through too much over the past 2 years, and we owe it to them to stand up for their education, to stand up for working parents, and to stand up for those kids who face very legitimate and sincere mental health difficulty, those kids that rely on our schools for nutritional programs, the counseling, the speech pathology, and frankly, for many, their basic safety. This is about doing what's right, and we'll continue to act decisively so that your kids can remain in class where they belong. Happy to take some questions.
10 years ago, Minister, 10 years ago, the Dalton McGuinty government imposed a contract on teachers. The courts ruled it was unconstitutional because it violated their rights. Is what you're doing unconstitutional?
We believe what we brought forth not only is constitutional, but ensures stability for children. We've made it crystal clear on our government's commitment. It's why yesterday we extended an offer to the union, an increased offer to the union, to avert this very discussion today.
How is this not a violation of workers' rights, though? You are taking away their right to collective bargaining.
We gave CUPE an option yesterday to come to the table with a reasonable offer. We presented an increased offer of 10% over 4 years with maintaining those benefits and pension programs, which are the best in Canada. We gave them...
They gave an ultimatum yesterday.
Pardon me. I'm just going to finish the question. I'll happily come to you. We gave them an option yesterday. Work with us, take away the 5-day strike notice so there's no strike on Friday. Because if we don't act today, if we don't introduce legislation as we speak, there will be a strike on Friday. And so we gave them that option. We enhanced our offer, and they still refused. And so here we are today in a position where we must act to provide stability for children, and that is the right thing to do.
Okay, but why not just leave it with back-to-work legislation and let an arbitrator sort out the contract? Isn't that sort of a less nuclear option?
Look, we have been clear from the beginning. Our mission is to provide stability and keep these kids in school. You just heard from the former Liberal Minister of Education about her challenges with this. We want to make sure that there is no disruption. We want to make sure that there's no issues, litigation or otherwise, that could essentially get these kids back out of class because of strikes locally or provincially. This proposal, this legislation, provides absolute stability for kids to the extent we can control it and ensures they remain in a classroom. Then nothing at all, now or in the future, could prevent the child's right to be in a classroom learning. And so that's why we've taken the actions we have today with a level of regret, because quite frankly, we would have preferred to get a voluntary deal when we increased the offer to the union, who has said, as recently as this morning, that 10% over 4 years, that maintaining 131 days of sick leave, maintaining the best pension and the best benefits is not enough. What would have averted a strike, according to CUPE themselves, is accepting their reasonable proposal of nearly 50% increase in pay, representing $19 billion sector-wide, because whatever we sign with CUPE becomes the floor of negotiations for the next 8 negotiations, including with our teachers. And so we brought forth a prudent plan. We increased our offer. We provided something I thought was quite fair, and more importantly, that maintains all the benefits and entitlements these workers have that, as you know, many people in the working economy do not. And they have proceeded on a path to a strike. And if we don't act today, if we did not introduce legislation now, this afternoon, there would have been a strike on Friday. And I believe there are parents in this province who demand that government is on their side, that we say enough is enough. There's got to be some stability. Think of what these kids have gone through. Speak to the pediatric hospitals and the mental health wards, the speech delay. We have kids that don't even have access to basic nutrition without access to our publicly funded schools. Is it not the obligation of government to stand up for them, to give them a voice, to ensure some continuity in their lives. I mean, the EQAO data is just one data point that every parent in this room already knew. Learning loss is real. Being out of class creates long-term impacts to their lives and the economy's productivity. And so we will act. We will introduce this legislation. And it is regretful that the union did not pursue. When we gave them an off-ramp, we increased the offer. We pleaded not to strike. That they're proceeding with this is quite frankly unacceptable. It's unfair. But obviously parents could be assured that we will act to ensure their kids stay in school.
Do you think the union is just exaggerating when it says that its members are on using food banks? Do you not believe them when they say that?
What I know is that our education workers play really critical roles in our schools. We honestly, I mean, they are important to the function of schools. They make a difference in the life of a child. So, and to answer the question, what I know is that education workers in Ontario are paid the highest in Canada. What I know is that the average hourly wage is $27. I know that they're entitled to indexed pensions, which most Canadians do not have. I'm also aware that they have 11 paid sick days at 100% and 121 of short-term disability at 90%. I'm not aware of many folks in Canada that have those benefits. Now, frankly, we value them, which is why we're maintaining those benefits. It's why we're increasing the pay. It's why we offer them an option yesterday to avert this, where we transparently said, you know, we would much prefer a deal. But when the union announced the commitments on a 5-day notice to strike on Friday, no responsible government would sit back and hope for the best. They should, and we are taking action to ensure these kids remain in school.
So the real problem here, striking Friday anyway. CUPE says they're striking Friday anyway. So how does this provide any kind of stability? And did it not actually maybe push them to doing a strike that might have been averted if you could reach a deal at the table?
It's, you know, I've been saying through the summer, with regret then, as I do today, that this was the intention of the union all along. I don't believe, you know, there was any way for the government to get to the demands they have of nearly 50% in compensation, 33% increase in salary alone over 3 years. And so we offered in good faith the first offer, then we offered them a better offer. We then asked for an additional day yesterday to avert a strike, which the union has decided to put us on a 5-day footing, that this Friday, 2 million children roughly would be out of school. So we offered something better on the basis that it is affordable, it is fair, it represents the deep respect we have for the work they do. I mean, so much so that there are 7,000, nearly 7,000 more staff, education workers specifically, we're talking about CUPE type staff, in our schools since we formed government. In the program we brought forth to the union when we tabled it to try to get a voluntary deal, which they rejected, and then announced a 5-day strike, notwithstanding the increase we provided. We actually have 800 more workers, 800 more teachers, and 1,800 more educational workers through the maintenance of the Support for Students Fund for the next 3 years, on top of this year. So we are increasing wages. We're maintaining strong benefits and pensions, but we're also insisting that kids remain in school.
Because you're telling parents there's not going to be a strike on Friday based on government actions, but we're hearing there is. Is there anything the government can do short of finding some common ground at the table with CUPE?
It is obviously very regretful, very concerning to hear that. It is certainly our intention that kids will be in school. We will pass a law. And obviously, I think there's not a parent in this province who would be supportive of children staying home for even 1 day of a strike. The Premier made this clear. The government made this clear. Medical and pediatric experts, academics, teachers in the front of class have made it clear. These kids need to be in a school, in a routine, learning, getting back to basics, enough of the disruption to their lives. And this is not just an academic challenge. It causes long-term impacts to their lives, their mental and physical health too, their social development. There are so many young kindergarten teachers who talk to me all the time, and probably to you, that their kids don't have basic reading skills. Stability is the important outcome we can achieve for parents, but more importantly for their kids. We gave the union an option. We pleaded with them to accept it, a better option, by the way, where we moved. The only force at the table who's been intransigent, who's been absolutely insistent without any concession or move at all, certainly when we had this discussion Sunday, was CUPE, who said, no, we are going to strike unless you accept our nearly 50% increase in compensation, of which includes a 33% increase in pay for workers who are objectively paid highest in Canada, who make more in our schools, than they do in a hospital, a college, a university, or the private sector. And we believe in them and we support them, so much so that we're going to increase their pay every single year over the course of this contract. But they've made the decision to strike, and we've made the decision to introduce legislation to provide stability. And I do hope common sense will prevail, the interests of kids will prevail, and those workers will be in school on Friday, do the right thing for 2 million kids that depend on all of us to be the adults in the room and put our kids first.
Well, we're talking about some of the lowest paid workers. Two things. Are you concerned optically that 70% of those are women? And are you concerned about the heavy hammer that you are attempting to drop?
My concern is for the 2 million children, for the moms and dads who care for their kids, who would have to be upended in their lives again. Keeping in mind, we just went through strikes in this province 2.5 years ago, then followed seamlessly by a once-a-century historic pandemic, right? Like, I think about the kids. I care about the workers, which is why we're maintaining their benefits, their pensions, and we're increasing their pay every year, 10 points over 4 years for the majority of our working staff. But I care most, at the greatest level of concern for children. And frankly, every parent knows that they've seen the regression in their kids. They've seen the impacts of this pandemic. Every child has seen some change, and some have been very dramatic. Some have led to, sad outcomes. And I think that needs to be front and center in this discussion. I think kids need to be front and center.
What about concern for the 70% of the women who may be struggling to make ends meet? Perhaps they're single moms.
Right.
What about those optics?
Well, I think it's important that they know that we are going to increase their pay by 2.5% every year, right, up to that level, 10% over the course of this program. We're going to maintain their benefit program, which supports their family. We're going to maintain their pension that gives them some predictability on when they can retire and some dignity in their retirement. It's going to ensure that they have paid sick days, 11 at 100% and 120 at 90%. That is a pretty competitive program, and you compare Ontario to other jurisdictions, BC, Quebec, some of the bigger provinces are small, we still are ahead. I mean, and for our teachers, for example, we're the highest paid in Canada. And in Ontario. And so we do this, I say this not as a side fact, I say it because it speaks to the heart of your question. We do value them, which is why we're increasing their pay and their supports. But we do insist, and I think every parent insists, that we ensure their kids remain in school. We could have that debate, but kids shouldn't pay the price no longer. Honestly, it's deeply, when you speak to parents and you see the struggle they face and the angst they have for their kids and where they're at, it is incumbent on a responsible government to say, enough, these kids need to be in school. And that's what we're doing today. We're providing the stability I believe the overwhelming majority of the population wants us to do. Even if it is difficult, it is right. And kids deserve to be in class.
Minister, are you concerned about broad labor reaction to this, to broad labor chaos? Doesn't get any more fundamental to unions and collective bargaining.
Right. I think this bill is very specific to CUPE by design. It makes it clear the intent is to narrow cast it on just those workers that decided, for that union that decided yesterday to announce a strike. Right? We wouldn't be here, Antonella. I would not be standing here, frankly, introducing a new law today if the union didn't decide to put themselves in a 5-day strike, confirming that Friday kids would be out of school for roughly 2 million kids. They made that choice. But before they made that choice, we reached out to them and said, look, let's meet one more time. Let's try to find a voluntary agreement, a resolution that is, livable for all sides, a decent option. And we did. We offered them more. We said, please don't do this. We actually told them yesterday, we will move forward with legislation should you proceed, because we will not tolerate a day of a strike. And it's sad that we're here, because I think most parents would have preferred a deal that all sides could have consented to. But I think the metric of success when it comes to the parents, or the benchmark by which they're going to evaluate this bill, is will their kids be in school? And that's the intent of the bill. It's what it achieves. In the meantime, we'll continue negotiating with other sector partners and our teachers, really to get a voluntary deal that is fair for their workers and respects the good work they do, but most especially keeps these kids in school now and right to June.
If CUPE members do go on strike, like the union is saying they still will on Friday,
right,
and this legislation has passed, back of the napkin math is that this would be hundreds of millions of dollars in fines to their members in the union each day. where's the government going to draw the line? Are you going to make an example out of certain workers, or is it prepared to go about fining every single CUPE worker who is in fact striking?
Well, the legislation sets out those particulars really to deter any violation of the law. My hope is, frankly, that over the coming days, some cooler heads will prevail here, that we won't be encouraging workers to walk out of schools and impact kids and break the law, that we will be present for children every day, doing our very best with the commitment to keeping these kids in a stable, safe environment. And I think it would be very, very unfair to children, even after the government passes the law, which is the intent ahead of Friday, to see millions of kids pay the price again for another day of escalation by the unions. There just isn't tolerance for that. And I don't think it's fair to the kids. I don't think it's fair to the families who now have to take off work, the schools that will close childcare, which affects literally millions of people in our communities and our economy. Honestly, that's not fair, and our kids deserve better. And I really hope that over the coming days we could come to our senses, and there will not be a strike that impacts children on Friday, that they will stay in school every day, as is the spirit of this bill. The reason I'm standing here in the first place is because the union rejected the offer to rescind, to withdraw their strike. They're on a path to a strike on Friday if we didn't act today. And I think it is the right thing to do, just on the basis of the interests of children, giving them a voice, standing up for their interests and welfare. I mean, this has gone on for a long time, these strikes in Ontario. But the last couple of years, honestly, it makes it such a special moment in the history of this generation. Never have young people faced so much difficulty in such a prolonged period of time. And so, yes, I'm appealing on a moral basis to the workers who I know love these kids, that they will do the right thing, show up, make a difference, and continue to enrich the lives of a child. But we obviously have no tolerance for disruption or a strike of any type.
Are you going to try to reach a deal while you pass this legislation? Are you open going back to the bargaining table?
We gave the union an option to do that yesterday. We invited them. We increased their offer. They rejected it and said, no, we're striking on Friday. The government is going to pass the bill. We're going to move forward and provide stability.
Negotiations.
We gave the union yesterday an option to come forward. When they announced, on the day they announced their intention to strike, right? They announced on Sunday that they're going to go on a strike on Friday, right? We said, okay, let's meet that afternoon, give them a better offer, urge them not to strike. And they said, thanks, but no thanks. We want nearly 50%. We want a $19 billion cost when applied sector-wide. What you're offering is insufficient. And so they're proceeding on a strike. And so we are proceeding with legislation to avert the strike and to provide stability parents deserve.
They say they're working on a counter-proposal. Are you saying you're not going to hear it out?
We have made clear to the union. They had an opportunity to present to the government a counter-proposal that they may or may not introduce. This is very abstract. You know more than the government or the school boards, for the record. But, what I'll tell you is this. We gave them that chance. They could have said to us, give us a day. They said, no, we're going on a strike on Friday because we insist upon an increase of pay of nearly 50% and compensation, to be more clear. And I think that's really unfair. I think, frankly, it's disappointing because I actually believed yesterday that maybe was their off-ramp they needed. Let's find a middle ground here. We'll increase our offer a bit. They withdraw the strike, the recommendation, or the commitment to strike on Friday. But they didn't do that. In fact, they doubled down and said, we will strike unless you accept our, what they will call, affordable $19 billion offer. And I don't think many people know or expect that.
I mean, you said that if you give them this increase that they're looking for, then you have to give it to everybody. Why? Why is that?
Yeah, so there's essentially within labor negotiations, the Me Too clause will be essentially whatever we sign with CUPE today, the first bill, the first contract, becomes the minimum standard as a Me Too. Those other labor partner negotiations will automatically get that because they're built into the contract. So that if someone goes first and someone later gets a better deal, the first union gets lifted up. The point is that becomes the minimum, the starting line of discussion. A $19 billion ask, a nearly 50% increase in compensation, 33% in pay alone. And I know, look, and I know I'm not speaking specifically to your sector of work, but I don't think most people at home are eligible for those increases. They're working harder and taking home less. And I do believe these folks deserve more, which is why we're offering 10 points over 4 years, giving them entitlements and benefits and pensions and sick leave that most people could only dream of. And so we offered them something better. They rejected it and confirmed a strike. And today, to avert the strike that the union themselves are on a path to, this Friday, like in a couple days, we are taking action, as I think any responsible government would do, to bring some stability to these kids and bring some certainty to their parents, who I think are very anxious about this circumstance.
Me Too clauses then the problem? Like, could you not go do something legislatively to end that practice instead of using the notwithstanding clause to steamroll this particular union right now? Could you not, isn't a room for reform? If that's really the issue here, is that if you offer what might seem reasonable to some people, but if it becomes unreasonable if you have to apply it to absolutely the entire sector, isn't that like the actual issue here?
I think the issue is that we have an education union on a path to a strike, irrespective of what the government offers, unless it's nearly 50%. And I think that's unfair to kids, and that's why the government is acting today to keep them in class. Yes, please.
Just to follow up on my colleague's question.
Sure.
So, doors closed as far as negotiations go, and does CUPE know that? Because it sounds like they are preparing to come back tomorrow, if I understood them correctly.
We made it clear to CUPE, abundantly transparent yesterday, that withdraw the strike notice, work with the government, accept what we thought was a reasonable increased offer of nearly 10%, and they said no. They said we are going to strike on Friday, and thus we're going to move forward, pass this legislation, and keep kids in class, providing the stability that children in this province deserve. Thank you so much. Thank you.